Hello? Hello? I can't hear you. Give me a second. Hey there. How's it going, man? Can you hear me? Give me a second. I can't unmute you for some reason. I don't know why.
It's because I'm not muted. When we do this debate thing, you get to do your introductory speech and I get to do mine. So since this is your topic, I'm going to let you do your introduction to it and we can go from there. So I'm not muted. I'm listening.
Awesome. So, like, I just want to see how I'm gonna start this debate. That way, the time could start going. Has the time already started? Okay, perfect. So I can open up, right? I can open up with my. Okay, gotcha. All right. So I'm gonna begin with just stating my case that Israel is a world burden, and it has been a world burden for many years. And this is the reason why the United Nations Security Council has devoted nearly a third of its deliberations to Israel, which has 1,000 of the world's population. For many years, they have prioritized the needs of the Palestinians over Israel, despite Israel on various occasions and in numerous in many decades, like on various occasions in over the decades, Israel has agreed to terms with Palestinians to give up territory in exchange for peace. And what we've witnessed over the decades, since the 1948 independence of Israel, Israel has not been able to establish peace with the Palestinians despite their agreements to give over territory. So with this happening for so many decades, it's really a time that we begin to look at a new strategy for the United Nations to begin examining new strategies in order to seek ways to establish peace, because the two-state solution has not been working and it has effectively failed. And it's about time I argue that Israel has a state of its own where it's established as a majority, but to live in cohesion with the Palestinians, but where they are the ones.
Hey, it just cut you off. I'm just letting you know that so you can hear me. It cut you off. I'd like to start with your first statement about the fact that I have no idea where in the world you think that the Israelis have been prioritized over the Palestinians. At the end of this debate, I'm going to put in the comments section all of my sources and stuff like that. But starting in 1946 was when we started giving Israel some land. Around 1947, the UN decided that they were going to give Israel a lot more land and separate Palestine basically into two different sections. Israel has no right to the land beyond the fact that they feel they're entitled to it. And there's a lot of different arguments to why they feel they're entitled to it. One of them is biblical prophecy, which is basically Zionism, which is that it's supposed to be their homeland. It's supposed to be where they're from. It's supposed to be, this is the Jewish land and it's supposed to be ours. And because it's supposed to be ours, therefore it should be. And that's not a good reason to give land to anyone. If you came to me and said, I know you've been living in this house for 50 years, but I have a piece of paper or a book that's 200 years old that says that I should live in this house. That doesn't give you a right to move into my house just because you feel that you were given that right. So the mic's about to pass him automatically back over to you. But what I want to say is that the Palestinians are basically suffering in silence. And the Israelis have more power than almost anyone else in that area. So mic's to you.
All right. So I definitely disagree with your statement that they feel that this is a sort of entitlement to them, because historically, the PLO claims to represent the Palestinians, and they say the struggle with the Zionist, and they have even went on record and saying that the struggle with the Zionist enemy is not a struggle about Israel borders, but Israel's existence. There has never been a Palestinian people, culture, religion, or economy. The claims of descent from a Palestinian people who supposedly lived for thousands of years in a land called Palestine is unfounded. Now, in archaeological findings, which predates Google or encyclopedia and whatever you use to establish research today, in 130 AD, now maybe you could record this in your head or on your notes. In 130 AD, the Romans renamed Israel Syria Palestina, and that's where the name comes from. And the Jews living there at the time became known as Palestinians. During World War II, the British Army had a Palestinian brigade made up of entirely Jewish volunteers. The Palestinian Symphony Orchestra was all Jewish, and the Palestine Post was a Jewish newspaper. In 1948, Arabs who had fled Israel made claims that Israel had always belonged to them, and they were the true Palestinians. This land has always belonged to the Jews, and the Arabs at the time only owned 3% of Israel at the time they made these claims that Palestine had originally belonged to them. There's no archaeological findings that could substantiate that this was always Palestinian territory, and the Jews feel some sort of entitlement from God, because historically, point by point, Israel has always existed in the land through every occupation from the Babylonians to the Medes and Persians to the Romans to Islamic invaders to the Crusaders who took it over from them. There's documented evidence, and I could give you documented quotes from the popes at the time of the Crusades.
All right, it cut you off again. I'm letting you know just because I'm trying to be courteous. What you're saying is just blatantly not true. If you look at, as far as archaeological evidence, there are coins that date back many hundreds or thousands of years that show Palestine as is printed on the coin, Palestine. Palestine has been a state, and the Palestinians, or rather the Arabs who live in the state of Palestine, have lived there for thousands and thousands of years before the Jews even existed. Before the Jews were a people, Palestinians lived in that area. So that's just patently false. And it's absolutely deplorable to me that you would think that it's not. I mean, that's just something that we know for a fact. But let's just go ahead and throw all of that out the window. If what you're saying is true, and that, okay, let's talk about well, first off, I want to hear your ideas about why a one-state solution is better than a two-state solution, because Israel from 1946 to now has constantly invaded Palestinian territory, from the West Bank to East Jerusalem and other areas. They have constantly invaded Palestinian territory and taken it over as their own because they claim it's their right. So I'd like to ask you if you think that the 1967 borders and that the 1967 land agreement, which the ICJ and the UN both say is binding, legally binding, if you would say that is okay, or do you disagree with the 1967 boundaries? Because as much as I don't think Israel has a right to exist as a state, I don't think that's a realistic option at this point.
Okay, perfect. All right, now you made a couple claims, and I want to address it before I really get to address my take on the 1967 partition of the East Israel. I assume that you're probably referring to. Now, again, you make claims that this is unfounded, and I gave you documented evidence, I gave you documented statistics, and I gave you I gave you the years this happened, and yet you still claim that Israel has never had any right to the land. But that's okay, because I'm going to give you more evidence, and I'm going to continue to substantiate my case. In 70 AD, the Roman army under Titus sacked Jerusalem and killed many Jews, as the Jews living there had to immigrate as refugees to other countries in Europe. So this is evidence in 70 AD that Jews were already living in Israel. There is no, like, you can't show me where in 70 AD, or you can't find any documented evidence where Palestinians were living there and while they were invaded by the Roman army. You even have at one point the Babylonians, as I mentioned, the Babylonians occupied it. the Medes and Persians. In 333 BC, I'm giving you another documented year, 333 BC, Alexander the Great occupied Palestine for the Greeks. And the Egyptian later occupied it, and after the Syrians, and later Romans. And the Ottoman Turkish Empire occupied for 400 years. In all these occupations, the Jews lived in the land of Israel and suffered under the hands of those world powers. The Roman Catholic Crusaders, I'm gonna give you documentations. They slaughtered the Jews. They slaughtered Jews that were living there and took over the land for the Catholic Church. I'm gonna quote Urban II at the time, who helped organize the first crusade. He ordered the Crusaders to start upon the road. He said in a quote, he said, "Start upon the road to the Holy Sepulchre, to wrest that land from the wicked race and subject it to yourselves." He ordered the Crusaders to do this to the Jews. So what they did was they set the...
Okay, I don't doubt that there were horrible things that happened to the Jews. There were horrible things that happened to almost every religious group in history and every ethnicity in history. So I'm not doubting that. What I'm saying is, well, first off, you said that the Palestinians have never existed and that there is no history of Palestinians. And yet you just said that Alexander the Great occupied Palestine. So which is it? Which is it? Is it that the Palestinians never existed and the state of Palestine never existed, or it did? Which one fits your narrative? Because it seems to me that you're only willing to accept facts that fit your narrative. The 1967 borders you didn't address, they are internationally binding by pretty much everyone's terms. Every single international community or international court, pretty much every country besides Israel and maybe one or two others, thinks that the 1967 borders are legally binding, and yet Israel continues to build its settlements, invading inside Palestinian land, violating the UN, violating international sanctions, and violating human rights. The Israelis have forcibly and fertilized people who have come in as immigrants from Ethiopia. There were people who were forcibly injected with birth control that did not want that. But without getting into that, I hate this time limit because it's making it impossible for us to have a debate. But I'd like to hear your ideas on the 1967 borders, because if you think a one-state solution is the best option, then I'd like to hear why the entire international community is wrong and you are right about this.
All right. Okay. Before I can address the 1967, I still have a point that I have yet to fully address. Now I don't know how to get my ideas together. Okay. Crap. Crap. I'm trying to think here. Okay. The PLO. You stated how I made a claim about Palestinians. Which one is it? Did they exist, or were they already in the land, or were they not? But at the time when it was called Palestine, during that documentation I gave you, the Jews were the ones who were called the Palestinians. They were the ones that were, again, I gave you I already addressed this part. I'm gonna have to address it again. I told you that you had Palestinian Post. It was a Jewish newspaper. The Jews were known as Palestinians at the time when that name was transferred by the Romans to Syria, Palestina, and that's where that name comes from. So Arabs are the Palestinians we know today, but they were not the Palestinians of the past, of the time period that I'm addressing in the AD part of history. So when you hear Palestine, don't think in terms of today, the Arabs of calling themselves Palestinians because they're born in Palestine, but it's more of the Jews that were born in Syria, Palestina, that were called Palestinians, but they were actually Jews. And again, I mentioned to you that it was not until 1948 when Arabs was fleeing Israel made claims that this land had always belonged to them and they were the true Palestinians. That now this has become a truth that is taken by the UN, and now the UN preaches it as if it has always been true, even towards the century I talked to you about in AD. Now with regard.
All right, you were about to get the 1967 borders, which is the whole topic of the conversation. I wish you could stay on point, because the whole point of this conversation was about whether a one-state solution or a two-state solution is the best option. And clearly you're not making a case for a one-state solution. So let me make a case for a two-state solution. I personally do not believe Israel should exist, period. I don't believe Israel has a right to exist. I do not believe they have a right to the land. I do not believe they should exist, period. Now, realistically, that's not going to happen. They are there. They are one of the most powerful military forces in the entire world. They're a nuclear power. They lied about that to the United States for a very long time and denied, and still will not let anyone access or see their nuclear weapons. And still pretty much they try to deny that they exist. But going back to the point of the conversation, the 1967 borders are binding and they invade Palestinian land. The problem with the Jewish state is greed, that they were given land based solely on the fact that they felt like they deserved it. After World War II, people basically said, listen, we need to give the Jews a place of their own. And so they gave them Israel, but they gave them Israel by giving them Palestinian land. Now, what you were saying about the Palestinians being Jews is just ridiculous. The Palestinians were not Jews. They were Arabs. And the Arabs were not Jews. They were very different people. And I'm talking about pre-Christ, pre-Judaism, that the people who lived there were the same group of tribes that had lived there for thousands of years. When religion came in, it separated things, but the people who lived there were Palestinians living in Palestine.
Okay. Now, with regards to the 1967 partition, right? The United Nations, they adopted a United States resolution. It was called United Nations Resolution 181. And what this resolution did was petition Palestine, giving 18% to the Jews and 82% to the Arabs, making it an international country, never to be under Jewish control. That's all that this did. And you have when Israel did take over East Israel, when they did take over East Jerusalem borders after the 1967 war, they gave that land over to the king of they gave it to the king of Jordan. They gave it up to Jordan. Matter of fact, they didn't give it up. They just left. They just abandoned it. They just left it desolate. And what the king of Jordan did was he gave it to the Palestinians in 1994 when Arafat was the president of the PLO, which is a terrorist organization. And what they did with this land was, as has been documented on many news outlets and even on
Unfortunately, you're cut off yet again. I don't like this debate format. I'll just tell you up front. I really wish we could have an open mic conversation, but unfortunately, this is how things are structured right now. But as far as Israel existing, Israel exists because they were given land. Not that they were entitled to it, not that they deserved it, but that they were given it, basically as a safe space. And what Israel did with their land, instead of saying, thank you, we have land, is they implemented Zionism, which has existed over the past 100 years. I'm not sure if you follow any of the Jewish scholars, such as rabbis who are against Zionism, but there's a rabbi named Rabbi Weiss, W-E-I-S-S, and he said basically Zionism has turned Judaism from something spiritual into something materialistic, where originally Judaism was about spirituality, whereas it's turned into something materialistic. Because if you study the Torah, it actually talks about how the Jews should not have their own land because it is not something that biblically was given to them, that God told them that is not something that they should have. But that's a discussion for a different time. My point is that a one-state solution is not possible, because when you invade somebody else's land and take it without any reason beyond a gift or beyond entitlement, it does not give you the right to that land. And when you try to say, well, even though we were given this land, we're entitled to all of it, that creates